folks. It is Friday afternoon. I usually do this Acts teaching on Thursday morning. Actually, yesterday I did do the teaching. I sat right in this chair and I gave the whole teaching, and when I finished, I went to close the camera to shut off the video and discovered I'd never clicked to turn it on. So you're going to hear the second run through of this teaching a day after I normally do it. We're going to go through Acts chapter 27 today, and we really only have one more chapter after this one today to finish the book of Acts. I haven't decided yet where I'm going to go next time. Some of you who watch this might send me suggestions. I have lots of different material, lots of things that I'd like to go over with you, lots of books of the Bible and various other topics. We'll be thinking about it and praying about it. And any of your comments, if you send comments, that might help me to decide where to go. But anyway, let's get into the teaching today on Acts chapter 27. First, let me just check the camera to make sure it is running today. Yes, it is. It is in fact running. It's a miracle. All right, so let's review a little bit chapter 26. This was the chapter where Paul was put on trial before King Herod Agrippa II and his wife Bernice, and the new governor of Palestine, Porcius Festus, a Roman governor. And it was one more public trial for Paul there in Caesarea Maritima on the beautiful coast of Israel, for the purpose of determining more fully what it was that he was charged with, what his beliefs were, and so forth. And you remember, Festus was new as the governor. He didn't know much about Jewish customs and such, whereas Herod Agrippa was recognized as rather somewhat of an expert in Jewish customs and traditions, and he knew a lot about all of this, and he was interested to hear from Paul. So they had this big pomp and ceremony and everything, and they brought Paul in, and he saw that it was an opportunity not just to defend himself. He knew that the real purpose behind it all was that God had him there to present the gospel, even to these leaders, Porcius Festus and Herod Agrippa and all the others that were there. So he went for it and presented the message. Of course, at one point, Festus, not having much of a background in biblical thinking and Jewish customs and so forth, he hollered out right in the courtroom, "You're out of your mind," you know. And it's because he was not a spiritual man, and to him the things of the Spirit of God were foolishness. But Paul was appealing to, Agrippa most of all, but all the people, and he said, "Would to God that you would become like me." He wanted everybody to be Christians. And so we come now to chapter 27. The last thing we saw in chapter 26 was some information that Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, we don't know where he obtained the information, but somehow he found out that these leaders conferred among themselves after the trial and said that Paul could have been released if he hadn't appealed to Caesar, because he had not done anything that was really criminal and deserved any kind of legal punishment. So then, now we come to chapter 27, verse 1. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius. That makes me think of orange Julius's that I used to always drink out in California. I don't know if you ever had one, but they're good. Anyway, he belonged to the Imperial Regiment. That was his unit. We boarded a ship from Adramyttium, about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, the Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. So this is a classic sea adventure. I love this chapter. I love the sea. I love ships. I love to read about ancient mariners and such as that, and the different things they went through. Actually, this chapter sheds a lot of light on how ships and sailors function in the ancient world. It is a reliable resource that informs us a lot about nautical matters in the time of the first century there. And by the way, there's a sailor by the name of James Smith who in the 19th century sailed the regions described in the book of Acts to learn more about Paul, and he ended up writing a book on it, The Voyage and Shipwreck of Paul. And that was published in 1848. The latest edition is 1880. It's considered one of the greatest resources for study on this history. So anyway, Paul's turned over to a military guy. Probably a centurion is kind of like an NCO, a non-commissioned officer today, but he's also kind of a little bit like a lieutenant in our army. But anyway, he had this responsibility of getting him and I guess several other prisoners all the way to Rome. And that must have been really something to be assigned such a thing. You've got to go. There's not military ships to carry you. You've got to get these people onto civilian merchant ships, if you will, and go from port to port and house them, get them put up for the night and so forth in different places, and guard these prisoners and get them all the way to Rome. I wouldn't want that job if the sweet Lord Jesus come down and asked me himself, as the lady said in the movie Driving Miss Daisy. But anyway, this section here is one of the we passages in the book of Acts, and we call them the we passages because the writer says, and then we did this and we did that. So we believe Luke wrote Acts, and so in these passages he seems to have been along and been aboard this ship with Paul, and so was this guy named Aristarchus from Thessalonica. We also read about him in Acts chapter 20, verse 4. And so here's these two Christian brothers that are going to go with Paul on this voyage. And you wonder where they've been, for the last couple of years. Because Paul was in jail or in prison there in Caesarea for 2 years. Luke already told us that. So what we assume is that probably Luke, during that 2-year period, he would visit Paul and attend to him, see what he needed and so forth, try to encourage him, try to hear from him and check on him and all that. But he probably also used that time to travel about the area of Palestine there and perhaps interview other people, other sources that he used for his gospel of Luke, which he probably, was writing around this time, or at least doing the research for it. And so, but they hung around there to take care of Paul, but you couldn't just sit there with him in jail all day. So they probably did that stuff, different stuff like researching and so forth. Anyway, the ship was from Adramyttium, which is in the northwest part of Asia Minor, which we call Turkey today. So probably it had come down to Caesarea hauling some sort of cargo from Turkey. Now it's going to go back. And so, they set out on this sea voyage. And some people can speculate that perhaps Luke and Aristarchus signed on as slaves so they could go with Paul. Or maybe Luke was the ship's doctor. Aristarchus was just a passenger. We don't know. But anyway, it's just conjecture. Verse 3, the next day we landed at Sidon. That's in Lebanon, up just to the north of Israel. And Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so that they might provide for his needs. From there we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. You can look at all this in a Bible map. You'll see these places. When the wind didn't allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salmone. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens near the town of Lasea. So, they set out from Caesarea. They go up the coast to Sidon. The Roman soldiers, the centurion sends a soldier with Paul. They go to find friends. He knew people there so that they could attend to his needs. That's how you would take care of people. It would save the Roman government, right? If friends of Paul could help him. And so you look on the map, you'll see, again, like I say, where they were going. Now, the way was difficult. They were leaving kind of late in the season. And if you watch the news and the weather, as I do every day, you know that there are prevailing weather patterns, especially in winter. Here in the United States, we see the fronts come in from the west and they sweep across to the east, and that's the way it always is. And sometimes a cold front dips down to us down here in Florida. Sometimes it brings snow to you out there in Texas or whatever. But there's these prevailing currents of wind and so forth, and it's always been that way. And so when you sailed from the eastern Mediterranean west during that time of year, you're going against the winds and so forth. And that's why back then they would kind of shut down sailing operations, during wintertime, because you just couldn't do it back then with oars and sails. It's just too dangerous, too difficult, and so forth. But anyway, they were fighting the winds. This would have been around the Day of Atonement or after that day, which was September 14th in that year. And so, the winds were or contrary. So they go up there, though, and they find a connecting flight, if you will, which was a ship from Alexandria. You know, it's down in Egypt. Egypt's the breadbasket of the ancient world, especially the Roman Empire. There was a constant traffic of grain ships from Alexandria to Rome and other parts of the kingdom. And so, you know, if you ever watch Fox News, you see Mike Lindell, the My Pillow guy, right? And he buys cotton from Egypt there. And so it's because they do produce the best cotton. And they also produce a lot of grain because it's the Nile delta there, and it's rich soil. So they get on this Alexandrian ship. Now, that would have been a pretty big ship for those days, massive for those days, actually. Big old grain ship, big cargo vessel. So they head on up, and they have difficulty arriving off Cnidus, and then they head south toward Crete because the winds made it necessary, and then they go to the lee side of Crete. Well, that means, if you don't know sailing terms, the lee side is the side opposite where the wind is coming from. So like if the wind's coming from the north, the lee side of Crete would be to the south down there because the island then blocks the wind. So they barely made it along that side of Crete, and then they arrived at Fair Havens, or what you would say in Spanish, Buenos Puertos, near the city of Lasea. Verse 9, much time had been lost and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the fast. So again, I mentioned that. This would be the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, the fast. So Paul warned them, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss of life to cargo and to our own lives also. But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest, and you can see it on a map of Crete. So a lot of time had been lost. They'd been delayed, and things are going slowly. It's not the way the soldiers and the sailors would have wanted because of the weather. And so, you know, the Day of Atonement is the time of the fast, and that occurred between late September and early October. And as I said, the ships just couldn't handle the winter weather and storms. So you had to call a halt, you know, around the middle of September as a rule. But now these guys are in a harbor they don't really like for wintering. The port wasn't that good. It didn't protect the ship that much. It was just a small bay and very open to the elements. And this town of Lasea was 5 miles inland. So that would have been inconvenient. It'd be too far from the ship. So, you know, they're thinking we should go on. Well, Paul speaks up and he warns them. Notice how this guy, he's a prisoner, but he's bold and he speaks up in every situation. He warns them. He says, look, I think it's going to be dangerous to proceed. But you can imagine how they might have responded to that. I mean, look, you're a prisoner. We don't care what you think, dude. Shut up, right? Number one, because, you know, like, let's face it, if you're a prisoner, how many prisoners want to get to the court and their trial? I mean, if you're innocent, I guess so. But some people don't want to go because, you know, you're going to be punished and you don't want to get there. So they're not going to listen to him. The pilot and the owner of the ship would have known a lot more, and they said it was better to go on. It's only 40 more miles, folks, to Phoenix. Imagine this. It's like 40 more miles, you know? And it would be a much better place to winter in if we could just make 40 more miles. How I relate to these guys, I would have done the same thing. Circumstances weren't good where they were, and the experts said it'd be better to go on. The majority said it'd be better to go on. And everybody's hoping for things to turn out. You know, you make a decision, you hope for the best. Human beings, we can't predict the future. And so we never know exactly what's going to happen. Now, in this case, they had a man of God there, an apostle, and he counseled them to stay put. But, you know, they didn't know who he was. They didn't know his background. They didn't believe in apostles and stuff like that. They didn't know he had some kind of special connection with God. So they had no real reason to listen to him. In fact, they had more reasons not to listen. But, you know, in hindsight, we can see how, boy, it's a lot better to listen to a person of God than to the experts or majority opinion, right? The problem is, number one, we don't always know the people that are recognized, right, that are valid servants of God. We don't have people that we can trust fully today. And we know this guy's a prophet. When he speaks, buddy, you better listen to what he says. And we tend to pay more attention to circumstances and stuff. It's interesting to me that Paul said he could see, or he perceived in another version, that the voyage would be disastrous to the ship and to their lives. He didn't say God told me. So we don't know. Did God tell him, or was this just sort of a sense that he had? I mean, look, he was on ships a lot, and the Bible says he was shipwrecked 3 times. This is going to be one of them, but we don't know when the other 2 times were. But he had a lot of shipboard experience. Maybe he just said, look, it's a bad time of year. I got a bad feeling about this. But anyway, godly people do have discernment sometimes and wisdom that can help them avoid dangers if, they'll heed it, or if other people will heed it. Paul said it'd be a danger to their lives. It didn't turn out that way. Of course, that could be because, as we're going to see, he prayed and he interceded. And so maybe that's why that part didn't come true. It wasn't a danger to their lives. So what he perceived wasn't exactly accurate. But anyway, it's interesting. What do you do when a person warns you about something? Years ago, I was in Quito, Ecuador. I was teaching at a YWAM base, and the guy there, the director, was Ukrainian. So I was real pleased because we spoke Russian some and everything. And he was 30 some years old, but he'd never learned to drive because in Ukraine, nobody had a car. Well, down here in Quito, Ecuador, he had a Land Rover, He bought a Land Rover down there, and he was learning to drive it, but he had to learn the manual shift too, as well as driving. And so he made me very nervous when I rode around with him. And this team came from Colombia one time, and they were staying with us, and so he carried them and me in his Land Rover to go to some kind of event. I can't remember. And then we were returning, and as we returned, we were going up this kind of a curving on-ramp onto a freeway down there. And as we went around this curve, he was going kind of fast, and there was sort of a pothole in the bridge. And when he hit that on this sharp curve, the Land Rover really tipped, and we had a lot of weight with all those people, and it really tipped, and there was the railing right there, and we went up like this, and I could see us going over this bridge and falling down to the freeway down below. It was pretty scary. Everybody was laughing and talking before that, but boy, when that happened, everybody just was silent the rest of the way. People were scared, and they were praying. Well, that evening, I had to go somewhere else to teach. And the wife of the leader of the base of that city in Colombia took me aside. She said, brother, look, I want to tell you, I feel like God is saying, don't go with this guy tonight. Don't let him drive you. You're a man of God, and your life will be in danger. Don't do it. And let me tell you, she really made me think. I was really troubled. Like, wow, this is the wife of a base leader. They're spiritual people. They're mature spiritual people. And she's telling me she thinks it's going to be dangerous. But what am I going to do? The guy's going to drive me. How else am I going to get there? I ended up going with him, and nothing happened, thank God. So I understand this, what it's like. I mean, sometimes people warn you and stuff. One time I was in Colombia, and I was supposed to preach in the open air this evening, and this pastor and his wife came, and they spoke to me, and they said, we want to warn you, you could be kidnapped tonight. You could be killed doing this. Boy, let me tell you, same thing there. That got me thinking. I went out in the jungle to pray, and I said, God, I hope I'm willing to die for you, but I didn't think it'd be today. And I really had to wrestle with that. So we just wrestle in life, huh? If you get a real sure word and God spoke, that's different. But so often it's not that clear. And so Paul is perceiving something, but nobody listens to him. So, verse 13, when a gentle south wind began to blow, they thought they'd obtained what they wanted. And so they weighed anchor, and we sailed along the shore of Crete. Well, see, the circumstances have changed. Now it's looking good, right? So let's go. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force, called the nor'easter, swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and couldn't head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. When the men had hoisted it aboard, they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. Fearing that they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun or stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. And so, this southerly wind began to blow, and it seemed like the confirmation of their hopes and dreams and such, and they set out. And you set out in life, you set out on a new business venture, or you set out on a new relationship or a marriage or whatever. You hope for the best, but there could be storms right around the corner. You just don't know. So this incredible storm comes down just west of where they launched from, Fair Havens. The coast of Crete just goes straight north. So once you get out there, just west of there, you're exposed to the northern gales that can come. You're no longer protected by the island. If that southern wind had continued, it would have taken them all the way up to Phoenix in just a couple hours or a few hours. But instead, they're hit by, the Greek says, Euroklaidon or Eurakilo, which means an east wind or a north wind mixed together, kind of a typhoon thing. And people up in Boston and all, or Massachusetts, they'd call it a nor'easter. So it comes down on them suddenly out of the mountains of central Crete, and man, they're just helpless. They couldn't head into it. They just couldn't fight it. So they had to just let the ship be driven along some 23 miles to where they could come behind this little island called Cauda. Again, they go in the lee, right, behind the island to get the dinghy aboard. Now it's hard. See, they used to let the lifeboat drag behind by a rope because it'd take up more room if it was on board the ship. But now they have to haul it on because it's too rough to let it be back. They're going to lose it. And so they go up and they rig ropes or cables underneath the ship, tying them off, and it kind of strengthens it as it's flexing. If you've ever been at sea, as I have, tremendous forces. That ship was creaking and groaning and wrenching back and forth and easily could break apart. The tremendous strain on a wooden ship like that. So they put these ropes under it. And then they put out a sea anchor. If you don't know what that is, think of like a parachute, but it's in the sea, and it's usually, we use canvas nowadays. It can be sort of almost like a big bucket kind of thing made out of canvas, or sort of like just a canvas parachute, think of it, with ropes hooked up to it, and you throw it in and it drags. And that makes the stern of the ship stay facing the waves as they're coming, because the wind's blowing you this way, and that keeps you straight. You don't want to turn sideways or the ship will flip over. So they threw out the sea anchor, and man, they're just going along, just being pounded by the waves. And it's so bad that after a day, they start throwing cargo over, and then they start throwing the very tackle of the ship that they would use if something broke. They have extra stuff on board to fix things. And they just start throwing it all over. So they're in bad shape if they're throwing their profits out and they're throwing their equipment that they could use to fix the ship. But they got no view of sun or stars for days. So think about it. Back then, there's no GPS. They don't even know where they're at, folks. And they're really scared of being run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, which is the coast of North Africa, because they're blowing that way. So they're really scared to go over there. You hit the sandbars, you're way out there, you're not even near the shore, you're going to die out there. And it seems like even Paul might have given up hope. This is a terrible time, folks. Life's like that. Whether you're a godly man or woman or not, you can love the Lord and yet go through terrible times. Look at the book of Job. He loved the Lord. He was a godly man. He prayed for his kids every day and stuff, and God allowed all these terrible calamities to come upon him. Life is a battle, isn't it? And there's times you have a car wreck like Tiger Woods had the other day, and then you're going to take 6 months or a year to recover, and you're in pain, or you have your business fails, or your marriage is going through difficulty, and it's a storm, man. I mean, it happens to godly people who love the Lord. You got to read these stories and see that. This is life, folks. This is not heaven, and nobody promised you a rose garden. There are battles, but that's why we're so much better off, because we have faith. Other people have nothing to cling to. We cling to God. We know that even if we die, though he slay me, yet will I serve him, said Job, right? We know that God works all things for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. So we have a hope they don't have. But boy, you got to cling to it, when you're in the midst of the storm. Verse 21. After the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before him and he said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete, and then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss." I love this. Paul says, I told you so. You shouldn't have done this. How come you guys didn't listen to me? Verse 22, "But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of the God whose I am and whom I serve stood before me, and he said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it'll happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. Man, this is so powerful. Because, it says right up above there, it says, we had given up all hope. So that probably includes even Paul. He's like, whoa, boy, we're going now, man. We're going to die here. This is bad. Even Paul may have given up hope, folks. He's a human being. And so God sent an angel. And I think that's so cool. Angels, they're spiritual beings. We don't know much about them. But, buddy, let me tell you, they can fly through storms. They don't need GPS. They know right where you're at. And if God sends them, they can get to you. The angel flew through space and time and got out there in the midst of the storm, came into the ship and appeared to Paul somewhere down below. Nobody else saw him, right? But he appeared to him and he said, don't be afraid. Why do you think he said, don't be afraid? Folks, because Paul was afraid. Hello. You be afraid too. I mean, we love the Lord. We know we're going to heaven, but it's the process of getting there that we're scared of, right? And so how's it going to be? And you're riding up and down and people are seasick and they're throwing up and it's just horrible. It's dark and gray. Paul was afraid. But God encouraged him and sent this angel to speak to him. And he said, Paul, what you're doing right now, you're on a mission from God, as the Blues Brothers said years ago, and you cannot fail. God has ordained that you're going to stand trial before Caesar. You're going to testify there. He told you that, right? Jesus appeared to Paul and he said, you'll stand before kings and you'll testify about me. And so you're going to go there. And so don't you worry. You're going to make it through. God's going to see to that. But then he also said, God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. The way that's expressed, saying God has graciously, by grace, given you the men that sail with you, that makes me think that Paul was interceding. He was praying. Wouldn't you agree? If God has given them to you, that means Paul had asked for them. Oh, Lord, save us, please. And God, please save all these men. They don't know you. They're lost. They're innocent. God, well, maybe not innocent, but they're lost and they don't know the right way. Please have mercy on them. So he prayed for them. It seems to me pretty obvious from the way that's expressed. And so the angel says, God has granted to you the lives of all who sail with you. So when God gave this word of encouragement, man, then he could encourage the crew. Isn't that cool? Paul said himself in Corinthians, he says, we encourage others with the encouragement that we ourselves have received from God. Isn't that cool? You go through difficulties and somehow or other you seek God and he just helps you and you can't even explain that sometimes. How did he comfort you? How did he help you? I don't know, but somehow he does, right? If we seek him, he does. And Paul says that when that happens, you go through that experience, then you can be a comfort to somebody else in that experience. Somebody else going through divorce or a bankruptcy or a terrible illness or a terrible physical affliction of some kind, So the angel gave him encouragement, and then he said to the people, hey, keep up your courage, man. It's going to happen as God said. He's not telling them just fantasy stuff, Pollyanna stuff. Hey, it's going to be okay. It's going to be all right. Why? Based on what? I don't really believe much of that when people tell me it's going to be all right. I say, like, based on what? How do you know that? You don't know that. But in this case here, see, God told him directly, it's going to be all right. God has promised you. So he had a word from God. And if you get a word from God, or if you can grab hold of the promises of Scripture, you can know that these things are true. God doesn't lie. And so you're going to get through, Paul. God's not through with you. All these other people are going to make it too. And he is an encouragement to them. This is so cool. A man of God in a difficult situation in life, he can not only receive from God for himself, but he can be a witness to others and an encouragement to others. That's what you and I are for. In the storms of life, folks, God leaves us here in this world, this fallen world, with all the problems we have to go through and all the difficulties we face. He leaves us here in this world so we can be his messengers and speak to others, giving them the comfort he gives us, and we can point them in the right direction and tell them, hey, look, turn yourself over to God. God will take care of you. God's going to protect you. He told me he would. I just think that's such an example for us of what we're supposed to be. We're with people. God lets us go through the calamities at the same time as others so that we can point them to the Lord. You know, as America's going through these crises that we're going through right now, that's what we're to do. We're to point the way forward. We're to tell people, hey, look, I don't know what's going on either. I don't like it either. But let's just trust in the Lord. Let's turn to God. Let's learn how to get a hold of God and cling to God in times like this. Verse 27, on the 14th night, can you imagine? 14th night, we're still being driven across the Adriatic Sea. Now, back then they called the Adriatic Sea a bigger area than what we call it today. Today it's up there just around Italy, but back then it extended further down. And so we were driven across the Adriatic Sea when about midnight the sailors sensed that they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we'd be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. So, you know, it's if you're a sea person, if you're a sailor and you've spent time at sea, you know, you don't have motors and engines running and all that. So there's just the pounding of the waves and the wind whipping and all, but they could somehow sense, maybe hear something afar off, you know, crashing of waves far away. They just sensed. They had this sense about them. We're approaching land. So they took soundings. If you don't know what that is, it's a long line with a lead weight on the end, and there are knots tied every 6 feet. That's a fathom. And so, or back in those days, they had a different measurement, the Greek measurements. And the New Testament has the Greek measurement, but it's translated in the NIV to a sort of an English measurement of feet. But anyway, that's the idea. You have a lead weight on a rope on a long line that has knots tied every so many, you know, to measure distance. It could be so many yards, so many feet, fathoms, whatever. So they found it to be 120 feet deep, and then it's getting shallower. It's 90. So, you know, they're scared. We're heading for some coast, and we can't see. It's dark. We might slam into the rocks at night and just be destroyed. So they throw 4 anchors out, and they pray for daylight, you know. By the way, some preachers will use a sort of a metaphorical approach to preaching, and they'll say, these 4 anchors represent faith, hope, love, and fellowship. Or these 4 anchors represent family, you know, and community and church and, you know, stuff like that. Well, it's cool, but that's not really how you should preach Scripture. Don't make things up. This is a real story about a real ship, and it has real anchors, which they threw out. And later on, they chopped the ropes and cut them loose. So if they're friends and family and all that, you're cutting them loose. I don't think it's a very good analogy. It's not good to make all these fanciful, metaphorical interpretations of Scripture. They're just ropes. Okay? Okay. So anyway, verse 30. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea. Remember, they had taken it on board days ago, pretending that they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it fall away. Look at that. Isn't that something? These guys are so selfish. They just want to save themselves, and they're like, we got all these other people on here, and, you know, I don't care about them. I know how to get to shore, and we have a better chance on the boat. Let's leave them. So there's the selfishness of man, the wickedness of man, you know. And so they pretend that they're going to go out and put anchors out in the front, in the bow of the ship. Well, Paul somehow knew what they were up to. I don't know if the Lord revealed it to him, or he just sensed it, or maybe he overheard him talking or something like that. And so he says to the centurion, hey, these guys got to stay on board here or we ain't going to make it. Why? Well, because we don't know how to man this ship and steer it in a storm like this to someplace safe. You got to have these sailors on board. And so the soldiers, when they heard that, hey, they don't like sailors anyway, so they cut the ropes and let the boat go. I wouldn't have done that. Why don't you save the boat and put some people on it at least? Give us a chance here, you know. But anyway, they got rid of it. And so you see the wickedness of people, that they're just out for themselves. Verse 33, just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you've been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. You see that? The fear they were under? They couldn't eat. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. After he'd said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. And they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, look at this. There were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. So again, Paul, you know, he's this example, this model for others. And he encourages them and says, look, we need to eat. Watch, I'm going to do it. And he just eats, you know. It's like our president gets a vaccination. Hey, I'll do it. a leader should model the right thing to do. And so he tells them, look, you got to eat. You need your strength. He exhorts them. And then he models it, and then he breaks the bread and eats it. I don't know if it's really bread, because then it says they threw the grain into the sea. Maybe he was just literally eating grain. I've done that before. You can chew wheat up. It's kind of hard, but it strengthens you. If it was bread, it was pretty old by now and hard and crusty and so forth. But he ate it. And so he told them, I believe we're going to be all right. So you guys eat. We're going to make it, right? And trust the Lord, that kind of thing. Verse 39, when daylight came, they didn't recognize the land. They're out at sea. They can't recognize it. They don't have GPS. Never seen this place before. But they saw a bay with a sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. So we're headed for sand. That's better than rocks. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. You see, they bound the rudders up when they're in the heavy storm because those waves slamming it. You don't want the rudder swinging around. Now you loose it so you can use it and steer. They hoisted the foresail, that's the little sail up front, to the wind and made for the beach. But they had good ideas, good intentions, right? But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and wouldn't move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land in safety. So, man, they're going to do their best. Again, I don't know if you've ever been out at sea, but I have. I've actually been out at sea in a canoe. Can you believe it? I've been in bigger craft too, but once I was even in a canoe, and it's really scary because how am I going to get this thing in when these waves are coming in? I got to really steer it well. And of course, I didn't end up making it. It flipped me, but I survived. But anyway, it's very scary. We're going to try to get in there to the shore. And so they head in, but they didn't know the depth there, and they hit a sandbar. So then the stern is just getting pounded. I want you to just visualize this, folks. This is a big ship. And the force of the waves was so great that it was just literally destroying this ship. It was smashing it. You can imagine the force of that, hitting the rear like that, the stern like that, and this thing creaking and groaning and shattering. And it's pretty scary. Big waves, broken wood. That stuff can hurt you when it breaks like that. Pieces can fly in your eyes, your face, or whatever. And so now, first you have the sailors who are selfish and they want to get out on their own and leave everybody behind. That's their wickedness. Now the soldiers want to kill Paul and the other prisoners. Why? Because you know how it was back then. The Roman authorities aren't going to accept their excuses when they say, well, we couldn't keep the prisoners. We were shipwrecked. They just said, well, why didn't you do away with them? You should have killed them. Don't let them escape. So they don't want to be punished. So they're going to execute them. But somehow Paul had an impact already on this centurion, Julius, and he said no, and he saved him. He saved Paul. He said, don't kill him. We're not going to do that. And so he told the people, if you don't know how to swim, you have to wait till it breaks up and then grab pieces of wood and try to make it on that. Those of you who can swim, go ahead and try now. So you imagine it's cold, man. It's freezing over there. I've jumped in the Mediterranean once in the middle, I did it in April and it was freezing. So this is really cold when they were doing this. And so they jump in, it's a gray, stormy day, smashing waves, rolling surf, and they jump in and they swim. And some of them desperate, they're afraid they can't swim, and they paddle their way in on pieces of wood, on planks, and they made it into land. And so, here we see again, the servants of God go through trials and tribulations and near misses and danger and so on, especially people who take their lives in their hands and go to other countries and all to try to serve the Lord. Sometimes you get more trouble in life because you walk with God than the person who's complacent and just goes with the flow, right? And so here we see this, that there was great difficulty and great affliction and fear and danger and trouble. But we also see how God came through, God promised, God encouraged, and he's omniscient, folks. He knows the future. He knew they were going to be shipwrecked. He knew the ship would be destroyed. He knows all the details. He doesn't beam Paul up, so that he doesn't go through that. See that? He lets him go through it, but he told him, you're going to make it to the end. Isn't that cool? That's the way our God is. He doesn't take us out of all the troubles, but he promises us he'll be with us till the end. Amen? So I hope that comforts you and encourages you. Next time, we're going to finish up the book of Acts with chapter 28. Until then, may the Lord richly bless you.